2 years of building and everything was finally ready. The scripts were locked, the sets were constructed, the actors knew their lines. Filming was scheduled to begin in March 2020. Then, the world shut down. 4 people in Los Angeles watched everything they'd created since leaving Telltale vanish overnight. They'd call the concept The Office Meets the Avengers, a live-action interactive TV show about the unglamorous people running a superhero dispatch center. The ones who answer emergency calls and fill out the paperwork, while the capes get all the glory. Real actors on real sets, cameras ready to roll, and now all of it was gone before a single frame could be shot. These 4 had already survived the crunch culture that burned through their former studio. They'd watched Telltale collapse around them, walked away before the walls came down, and built something new from nothing. And now a pandemic had killed their vision before it could draw its first breath. 6 years later, those same 4 people heard their name called at the Steam Awards, Outstanding Story-Rich Game. 3 million copies sold, 90 on Metacritic, their self-published debut. 30 people working out of Los Angeles had just beaten The Last of Us Part 2 remastered. But that triumph came after losing everything. Twice. First, the industry that raised them. Then, the project they'd built to escape it. AdHoc Studio, a game called Dispatch, and 4 people who years before that March afternoon were building some of the best narrative games ever made, not yet seeing the cracks forming beneath the awards. In 2012, Telltale's The Walking Dead swept more than 90 Game of the Year awards and changed adventure games forever. At the center of that breakthrough were 4 people whose paths kept crossing, and whose collaboration would eventually lead them somewhere none of them expected. Nick Herman directed one of the episodes and also stepped in front of the cameras himself, performing a motion capture for the character Glenn. That was early Telltale, small enough that a director could also be an actor, committed enough that people did whatever the project needed. And then there was Dennis Lenart, who helped shape the visual style, that living comic book aesthetic that made every frame feel like it had been ripped straight from the page. And Pierre Shorette and Michael Choung were both part of the writing team, crafting the choices that made players genuinely agonize over what came next. Save this person or that one. Tell the truth or lie. Decisions that felt like they mattered, because the people writing them made sure they did. The 4 of them worked well together, Telltale noticed. So when the studio greenlit The Wolf Among Us the following year, they turned to the same people. Herman and Lenart co-directed the first episode, while Shorette contributed to the script. The noir fairy tale earned 21 award nominations, a moody, violent riff on classic fables that felt like nothing else in gaming. And then came Tales from the Borderlands, with Herman directing the full series, Shorette serving as lead writer, and Choung contributed scripts throughout. The comedy landed as hard as the drama ever had, earning 4 more trophies for a studio that was starting to look unstoppable. But success has a way of changing things. Telltale had started as a scrappy outfit, a few dozen people making adventure games because they genuinely loved them. By 2015, that number had swelled past 300 employees. More projects meant more pressure, more layers of approval, more distance from the creative freedom that made those early games feel so alive. The 4 of them could feel it, something shifting beneath the surface, a cost that nobody was talking about yet. The cost was measured in hours. 50 a week became 60, then 70, then 80. Weekends treated as a given rather than a request. One lead narrative designer would later describe going from one crunch directly into another, no recovery time, no breathing room, just project after project, until the finish line became indistinguishable from the starting gate of something new. But hours were just numbers. What they bought looked different. People slept at their desks because going home meant coming back in 4 hours anyway. Developers worked until 3 in the morning, then did it again the next night and the next, with no idea that some of them would be laid off before they ever saw the project ship. One community manager had his doctor tell him to quit, not take a break, not slow down, but quit, because staying would break him. His therapist said the same thing. And then there were the rewrites. Work that teams had crunched for weeks to complete would come back gutted after executive review, 60% reworked, sometimes 90%, with changes demanded a week before episode submission. Those changes filtered through every department like shrapnel, forcing everyone to crunch again on content they'd already crunched to finish. The bugs that shipped weren't always technical. Some were just the fingerprints of exhaustion, the inevitable result of rewriting a script at 2 in the morning because someone higher up had changed their mind. The creative freedom was disappearing too. With 300 people in the building, every pitch had to clear more desks, survive more meetings, satisfy more stakeholders who might not understand what made an idea exciting in the first place. By the time 50 people signed off on something, the risky ideas had usually been stripped out, the adventurous stuff that didn't fit the template. Dennis Lenart would later put it plainly, when that many people need to understand and approve something, the more interesting ideas tend to die early. They just don't survive the process. And so the four of them found themselves in a strange position, winning awards, building games that sold millions of copies, while watching the thing they loved about making them slowly disappear. The trophies kept coming, but the crunch kept crushing, and the gap between successful studio and place worth working grew wider every quarter. Late one night at the office, somewhere between deadlines, a conversation started. What would it look like to do this on their own? Not at Telltale, not under someone else's structure, but as a small team with the freedom to say yes to something adventurous without needing 50 people's permission first. A place where crunch wasn't the default and where the interesting ideas didn't have to die. Nothing came of it that night. They went back to work and the crunch continued. But the ideas stayed with them, and in the months that followed, it became harder to ignore because the cracks weren't just forming anymore, they were spreading. The first one out was Michael Choung. In 2016, while his colleagues were still grinding through crunch cycles, he took a job at Night School Studio, the small team making Oxenfree with a handful of people instead of hundreds, a different kind of place entirely. Then, in February 2017, the other three made their move together. Herman, Lenart, and Shorette all joined Ubisoft San Francisco on the same day. They had a plan. Convince Ubisoft to let them form a new studio inside the company, somewhere they could build something different while still having the security of a major publisher behind them. It didn't work out. The studio within a studio never came together, but the four of them kept talking. Meanwhile, Telltale was cracking apart. November 2017 brought layoffs, 90 people, a quarter of the workforce. Pierre Shorette, already at Ubisoft by then, tweeted an offer to his former colleagues. Ubisoft was hiring, and he'd make introductions if anyone needed help. Some took him up on it. The rest of the industry watched and wondered how long Telltale had left. 7 months later, Telltale collapsed entirely. 225 people called into a meeting, laid off with no severance, given 30 minutes to leave the building. The four AdHoc founders weren't in that room. They had seen it coming and gotten out. In February 2018, the four made it official. AdHoc Studio. All of them still had day jobs elsewhere. No press release, no announcement. By late 2018, all four had gone full-time at AdHoc. They had a studio, they had a name, and what they wanted to build wasn't a game at all. For a year, AdHoc existed in silence. Four people working on something they wouldn't talk about, building from nothing, while the industry still reeled from what had happened to Telltale. Then in February 2019, they stepped into the light. Variety ran the exclusive. Former Telltale veterans had formed a new studio in Los Angeles, a team built around the people who directed The Wolf Among Us and Tales from the Borderlands. The article introduced all 4 founders and quoted their mission to carry the interactive narrative torch into the future. The timing raised eyebrows. Publishers were already calling episodic a failed experiment. The format that Telltale had pioneered? Dead. According to everyone with money to invest. The audience had moved on. The window had closed. AdHoc disagreed. They talked about a project in development, something combining their game experience with their backgrounds in film and television. All 4 founders had worked in both industries before Telltale, and they made it clear, whatever they were building, it wasn't going to look like what came before. But they didn't say what it was, not yet. The pitch was simple. The Office meets the Avengers. Not a game. A live-action interactive TV show. Real actors, real sets, real cameras. Workplace comedy set in a superhero dispatch center. The people who answer the calls, coordinate the responses, deal with the paperwork when things go wrong. The inspiration came from ESPN's This Is SportsCenter commercials. Those brief, deadpan ads where athletes wandered the ESPN offices in absurd situations. Workplace humor meeting celebrity egos. AdHoc wanted that tone, but with superheroes. Short vignettes, branching paths, designed for streaming platforms that were hungry for anything interactive. The timing felt perfect. Bandersnatch had just proven the demand. Netflix's interactive film became a cultural moment in December 2018, and suddenly everyone was talking about what interactive storytelling could become. Echo and Walmart had announced a $250 million partnership to fund exactly this kind of content. The technology had finally caught up to the vision. All 4 founders had film and TV backgrounds alongside their game experience. This was the project they'd been waiting their whole careers to build. By early 2020, everything was ready. Scripts locked, crew assembled, actors cast. Production scheduled to begin in March. March 2020, the world shut down. Production shutdowns everywhere. Social distancing requirements that made filming impossible. The exact month they were supposed to start shooting, gone. 2 years of work. Scripts, pre-production, casting, crew, all of it stopped. Not delayed, stopped. No timeline for when filming would be safe. No way to know if it would be months or years. The project they had been building since leaving Telltale was dead before it could draw its first breath. But 3 months before COVID hit, something else had happened.
There was a time when you were heartless, brutal, a monster. And I'm proud of you for changing all that, but I'm here to ask you to be those things once more. For them. For me. Can I count on you? Bigby, can I count on you?
Always.
At the Game Awards in December 2019, the new Telltale, rebuilt under different ownership, had announced The Wolf Among Us 2, and they'd announced the partner, AdHoc Studio. The founders who had created the original Wolf Among Us were coming back to help finish what they had started. It was supposed to be a side project, extra income while they built their own thing. Now with the live-action dream dead, it might be the only thing keeping the studio alive. The Wolf Among Us had been Pierre Shorette's project at Telltale, partnership with Nick and Dennis. They had built Bigby Wolf together, shaped his voice and his choices, created the noir fairy tale world that felt like nothing else in gaming. These were their characters, their creation. And now, a decade later, they were being invited back to finish what they'd started. When the new Telltale announced the partnership at the Game Awards in December 2019, it felt like a homecoming. The original creators returning to their own work. AdHoc would handle narrative and cinematic direction, while Telltale handled implementation. A clean slate, they were told, with as much creative freedom as they needed. For 2 years, they poured everything into it. They wrote an 800-page script covering a full season, every episode, every choice, every consequence mapped out. They prototyped and shot scenes, locked cameras, and directed performances. Nick Herman would later say they believed it was better than Season 1, and they had made Season 1. But something was wrong, and it took time to name it. They weren't running the project. Every decision went through someone else, and every choice they made could be overruled by people who hadn't built these characters, hadn't lived with them for a decade. Work for hire, that's what the arrangement actually was. Contractors on their own creation. They could write Big B's lines, but they couldn't decide what Big B would do. Then, Telltale needed more time. Progress stalled. An engine switch from Unreal 4 to Unreal 5 meant reworking everything they had already built, and the delays stretched longer. AdHoc couldn't just wait. They had a studio to run, staff depending on them, a future to figure out that didn't hinge on someone else's timeline. The conversations about leaving happened more than once before they made it final. They came close to staying, close to just collecting paychecks and continuing to build something they believed in, even if they would never own a word of it. But the work-for-hire model wasn't just frustrating, it was unsustainable. They were pouring years into characters they had created, a story they believed was better than the original, and none of it belonged to them. In 2023, they walked away. 2 years of work and 800 pages, characters they had created a decade earlier, and scenes they had directed, all of it left behind. Not their project anymore. Just something they'd have to watch from the outside, like fans, waiting to see if anyone would ever finish it. Pierre Shorette would put it simply, and there was resignation in every word. It's not our project. They needed something they owned, something no one could take from them. Dispatch was still there, buried under 2 years of Wolf 2 work, shelved since COVID killed the live-action dream. But the concept, superhero workplace comedy, interactive narrative, hadn't gone anywhere. They couldn't film it, but they could animate it. The pivot changed everything. Real actors became animated characters, sets became digital environments, the format shifted from interactive TV to interactive game. And somewhere in that transformation, a new mechanic emerged, the dispatch system itself. Players would manage a roster of heroes, send them on missions, watch consequences unfold, strategy layered over story. By 2023, they were building again, their own IP, their own vision, no partner to disagree with. But the industry disagreed with all of it. Publishers said episodic was dead. Telltale proved that. Investors said narrative games don't sell. Platform holders said superheroes were oversaturated. Everyone said a small studio couldn't pull off animation this ambitious. Pierre Shorette would later describe it, everyone tells you it's a bad idea for 7 fucking years. They kept pitching, kept getting rejected, kept building anyway. Private funding kept them alive, until it didn't. When the gaming industry started its wave of layoffs in 2023, AdHoc's funding got pulled. The timing couldn't have been worse. Microsoft was cutting 10,000 jobs, Meta was cutting 11,000. And studios across the industry were shedding people by the hundreds. In that climate, nobody wanted to bet on a small studio making an episodic narrative game about superheroes. So there it was, no more investment, no revenue coming in, and 30 employees depending on paychecks that were running out. The founders made a decision. For 6 months, not one of them took a salary. Michael Choung, Nick Herman, Dennis Lenart, Pierre Shorette. 4 people with families to support and mortgages to pay, living in one of the most expensive cities in the country. And for half a year, none of them brought home a paycheck. Every dollar went to keeping the team employed, keeping development moving, keeping the studio from collapsing entirely. That's 6 months of watching your savings drain, while explaining to your family why this matters. 6 months of believing in something nobody else would fund. For about a year, AdHoc was on the edge of closure, not metaphorically, actually on the edge. Weeks away sometimes, days away other times. The kind of math where you know exactly how many payroll cycles you have left, and every invoice feels like a countdown. The team knew it. You can't hide that kind of pressure in a studio of 30 people. Many of them started expecting Dispatch to be their final project in gaming, not because it would be a triumphant ending, but because the studio wouldn't survive to make another one. This was their one shot. If it failed, there wouldn't be a second chance or a pivot. They would just be 30 people updating their resumes and trying to explain a 7-year gap to recruiters who had never heard of AdHoc. Make or break. All or nothing. And still, after everything, after the crunch they had survived at Telltale, the collapse they had escaped, the pandemic that killed their first project, the partnership that turned into work for hire, the years of pitching to investors and publishers and platform holders who all said the same thing. After all of it, nobody in the industry believed in what they were building. Too small, too late, too ambitious. Episodic was dead, and narrative didn't sell. They had heard it so many times the words had lost their sting, but that didn't make them any less final. They didn't know that was about to change. While the founders weren't taking paychecks and the team was bracing for the end, an audition landed on Travis Willingham's desk. Travis was the CEO of Critical Role, the actual play phenomenon that had turned a home D&D game into a media empire with millions of fans worldwide. He was also a veteran voice actor with decades of credits across games and animation. Auditions crossed his desk constantly, and most ranged from fine to good to occasionally great. This one stopped him cold. He looked at the materials, the concept, the tone, the animation samples AdHoc had included. And then he did something he had never done before in his career. He picked up the phone and called the studio directly. Not his agent, not his manager, the studio itself. Travis would later say he absolutely flipped out. The animation was so good it looked like an animated series, not a game. Just from looking over the materials, he knew there was something special about what they were building. Nick Herman answered, and Travis didn't ask about the audition. He asked a different question entirely. Could AdHoc make something like this for Critical Role? Think about what that phone call must have felt like. Years of pitching to publishers who said episodic was dead, to investors who said narrative games didn't sell, to platform holders and executive and industry veterans who all delivered the same verdict. Years of being told no by people who often hadn't even looked at what AdHoc had actually built. And now someone was calling them. Someone who'd seen the work, actually seen it, and couldn't believe what he was looking at. Not asking if they could prove themselves, but asking if they could do more. Nick had been through enough to know that hope could be dangerous. They'd had promising conversations before, partnerships that looked good on paper before they fell apart. Every time you let yourself believe, the crash hurt worse. But there was something different about this call. Travis wasn't hedging or asking for proof of concept or market research or comparable titles. He was asking about possibilities. Someone with resources and reach had looked at what they built and seen exactly what they had been building all along. Not a project that needed to be fixed or a concept that needed to be validated, just the work itself, and the conviction that it was worth betting on. For the first time, someone said yes. That yes led to a restaurant in Studio City a few weeks later. Travis Willingham and Laura Bailey sat on one side of the table, Nick Herman and Michael Choung on the other. Critical Role and AdHoc feeling out whether this could actually work. The voice acting world is smaller than most people realize. The AdHoc founders had known the Critical Role team for years. Crossed paths at sessions, shared credits on projects, built the kind of casual familiarity that comes from working in the same industry long enough. But this dinner was different. This was business. Critical Role had everything except a game. They had built a media empire, podcasts, animated series, a fan base in the millions. But interactive storytelling was the one thing they had never cracked. Not for lack of trying, they wanted something that felt like their world, choice-driven, character-focused, built by people who understood narrative the way they did. Every pitch they'd seen felt like a cash grab with their logo slapped on it. AdHoc had exactly that. What they didn't have was time. After the private investment got pulled, after 6 months of the founders not taking paychecks, they were running out of runway. Dispatch was nearly finished, but nearly wasn't done. And done cost money they didn't have. Michael Choung would later describe the meeting as the kind of collaboration you hope for. They had known each other for years, he said, but when they finally started kicking around ideas, everything just clicked. The negotiations continued through winter and into spring. By summer 2025, they had a deal. But even before that partnership was announced, something else happened. In December 2024, 7 years after AdHoc first formed, they stepped onto a stage they had been building toward since the beginning. The Game Awards stage. 7 years after AdHoc formed in silence. 7 years after the industry declared episodic dead. 7 years of building something nobody believed would work. They revealed Dispatch to the world. The trailer landed like a statement. Animation so fluid, it looked like a streaming series, not a game. A tone that balanced comedy and stakes in ways the superhero genre had forgotten how to do. And a cast that made people pay attention. Aaron Paul from Breaking Bad, Jeffrey Wright from Westworld, the entire Critical Role ensemble. Names that didn't normally show up in indie game announcements. Press called it one of the most incredible trailers of the night, and social media lit up within minutes. For a studio that had spent 7 years hearing no, the world was suddenly paying attention. 5 months later, they released a demo on Steam, and players who had written off narrative games years ago tried it and came back raving. 98% positive from over 2,500 reviews, overwhelmingly positive in Steam's terms. The kind of response that doesn't happen by accident. And then, Tribeca called. The festival selected Dispatch as an official selection, one of the 9 games chosen that year. A small LA studio with no released games, standing alongside Annapurna Interactive and 11-bit studios. Not because of marketing budgets or industry connections, but because the work spoke for itself. July 21st, 2025, Critical Role made the partnership official. Dispatch would be funded to completion. AdHoc would build Critical Role's first video game, a narrative adventure set in the world of Exandria, merchandise deals, tabletop adaptations, the possibility of an animated series, everything they had built in crisis, in silence, in the years when nobody was watching, validated. The studio that had been weeks from closure now had a future. The founders, who had gone 6 months without paychecks, could finally pay themselves again. The team that had expected Dispatch to be their last project in gaming could start thinking about what came next. And now, finally, someone was listening. October 22nd, 2025, launch day. They released 2 episodes, not all 8, just the first 2. And then they asked players to wait a week for more. Their strategy was simple, weekly paired drops. 2 episodes every Wednesday, 4 weeks total. Not months between releases like Telltale had done, days. Research showed that gaps beyond 3 weeks killed engagement, that players forgot storylines and lost interest. So AdHoc designed Dispatch to work like a TV season instead. Hook players in week 1, let word of mouth build through week 2, watch streamers catch on by week 3, and deliver the finale in week 4 when the binge watchers were finally ready to buy in. Most games peak on launch day. Players show up, play through, and leave. The numbers climb once and never recover. AdHoc designed for the opposite. They built a game meant to grow after launch, betting that the audience everyone else had abandoned was still out there, waiting for someone to trust them with something worth waiting for. Self-published, $29, 30 people. Everything writing on 4 Tuesdays. The first week answered the question, 1 million copies sold in 10 days, and only half the game was out. 1 million people bought something incomplete because they trusted what they had seen. By November, the count hit 2 million. AdHoc had set a 3-year sales target, the number that would prove the studio viable long term, and they hit it in 30 days. But the strangest part wasn't the total, it was the pattern. Week 1 brought 12,000 concurrent players on Steam. Week 2, that number jumped to 65,000. By week 3, it had climbed to 131,000. Games don't do that. They peak at launch and the numbers fall from there. The pattern is so consistent across the industry that it's practically physics. Dispatch broke physics. Every week brought more players than the week before, as word of mouth compounded and friends told friends. Streamers discovered it mid-run and pulled their audiences in. Press reviews built through the month instead of dropping all at once, and players who had been waiting for the full season finally bought in at the finale, pushing the numbers even higher. The reviews matched the sales, 97% positive on Steam from over 90,000 people weighing in. With Metacritic landing at 90 and PlayStation owners rating it 4.95 out of 5. Critics called it the best narrative game in years, the true successor to what Telltale had been building before everything fell apart. 3 months after launch, 3 million copies sold. Self-published, 30 people in Los Angeles, 7 years of being told it couldn't work. 3 million people said otherwise. January 2026, the Steam Awards. Outstanding story-rich game. Community voted. Not a jury of critics, but millions of players choosing what mattered to them. And Dispatch, they won. 30 people in Los Angeles beat Naughty Dog at the Steam Awards, a self-published debut from a team that had been weeks from bankruptcy 18 months earlier, built on a format the industry had declared dead for 7 years. They kept building when everyone said stop. They bet on a format everyone had abandoned. They trusted an audience the industry had written off, and when that audience finally got something worth caring about, they showed up by the millions. March 2020, 4 people watched their project die before it was born. January 2026, those same 4 people held an award they had been told they would never earn. The studio that shouldn't exist. The game that couldn't work. The audience that didn't matter anymore. All of it alive. If this documentary gave you a good time, we'd be grateful if you checked out the other stories on this channel. There are more journeys like this one, studios that defied the odds, creators who kept building when nobody else believed, and games that changed everything for the people who made them. Thanks for watching.